Set foot on foreign soil. Only this land isn't ruled by any country or government. In this land we celebrate music. In this land we celebrate games. In this land we celebrate those who compose video game music. Welcome to the VGMbassy. Welcome and thanks for tuning in to another episode of the VGMbassy. This is a show centered around video game music and the amazing online community of fans and podcasters that enjoy it. My name's Ed, and on each episode I'll take the role of Prime VGM Minister and invite a guest VG Ambassador onto the show to share with us their own video game music culture. Or I may share a part of my culture on a solo show. And a solo show it is today. Ladies and gentlemen, my apologies. It's been about a month since my last release, and I didn't mean for it to go that long, but schedule just kept going crazy. Work's been crazy. Kids have gone back to school at the beginning of September, so home schedule's been very weird, and there's been less time in the evenings to record. Nevertheless, here I am, and I do think that this show will be a very special one for me and hopefully for you as well. If you think back a couple years to the VGMbassy episode 1, hopefully some of you still remember those days, you'll remember that I had our friend Emily Donnelly on to talk about her favoritist game series of all time, Echo the Dolphin. Well, today we are going to be visiting my personal Echo the Dolphin. I know you've probably heard me say it once or twice or 3 billion times in the past, but my favorite nostalgic game of all time is Bionic Commando on the NES. And so similar to the 1940X series show, which I released a few months ago, I am going to do a game music series history on the Bionic Commando games. Coincidentally, they are both Capcom series. They both had their starts around the same time. Bionic Commando a little bit later, but there has been a few more modern Bionic Commando games than the 1940X series. So we're going to get a wide variety of music in this show from a wide variety of composers as well, both Eastern and Western almost equally represented here, which I think is really cool. I'm super excited to share this. It's been a long time. I've wanted to do a show on Bionic Commando since back in the old Pixel Tunes days, and I just never fell on a good formula by which to present it. And now that I feel like I've honed my solo show skills with that 1940X series and a couple of the other game music history series that I've done, I feel like I can really confidently dig into Bionic Commando and share with you some of the magic behind these games. The game started off very, very simple. It was an arcade game released in 1987. It was 5 stages long, and it really didn't look too much like the Bionic Commando you might be familiar with from the NES or the Game Boy, or Bionic Commando Rearmed, which was on the Xbox 360 and the PS3. It was a bit more cartoony, it was much more simple, and it was still fun, but after playing the NES version and then going back and visiting the arcade version for the first time, I was kind of disappointed and maybe more shocked at how different the two games were. So I brought the show in with one of the more modern tunes from this series. That was the intro campaign song from Bionic Commando Rearmed 2, which was actually the last Bionic Commando game released to date. And I liked it because I felt that it's a good little microcosm of what our show is going to be. It's going to start off pretty simple chiptune, and then we're going to kind of slide into some real funky techno big beat music towards the end with Simon Viklund's amazing Bionic Commando Rearmed soundtracks. So that's just a little hint of what's to come towards the end of the show. So if you enjoyed it, you're going to hear more in that style for sure. But I think we should kick some things off with the iconic Bionic Commando arcade theme from the original game that started it all. So, this is called Forest, Stage 1 from Bionic Commando, released in the arcade in 1987, composed by Harumi Fujita. We'll be right back. Listening to Forest, Stage 1 from Bionic Commando, the arcade title, released in 1987, composed by Harumi Fujita. This is an interesting song in that the introduction is quite long, but the looping part never goes back to revisit it. Normally, in chiptune music, especially from this era, you'd have maybe a 5 to 10 second long intro, and then the major body of the song would loop over and over again. And for some reason, Fujita just chose to ignore like the first minute of the song and looped the end part. And they are two distinct parts. Like the first part of the song has a very calypso Caribbean vibe, which does not match the game at all, by the way, but it's dancey. You can almost hear like steel drums. It's got some really nice dynamic kind of like staccato parts here and there. It's fun, it's funky, it's fresh, it's kind of abrasive. I think this is using a YM2151, which most arcade games of the time used. Same chip that was in the Sharp X68000. Didn't have a sampler alongside it, which a lot of other 2151 hardware-based arcade games and the X68000 did. So I don't think she had a lot to work with in terms of percussion. So she's using really powerful chords to give that momentum and that rhythm. And so she's really pounding on those keys. And I do like that a lot, especially in FM music. It sounds powerful and triumphant when you play FM music like that. The looping part towards the end kind of loses that calypso feel, maybe gets a little bit more heroic. You know, the more I'm listening to it, the more I'm like, well, how does she get from this heroic sounding part back to the calypso part? Like, there doesn't seem, it seems like she like almost painted herself into a musical wall. Like, looping back to that calypso part would be a very difficult thing to do because she's got a completely different rhythm going on. So maybe that was a executive decision that she made. She's like, well, I'm at this B section right here. I'm gonna kind of stay here for a while. It's a decently long song for the time. So, you know, maybe she felt it was long enough and she just wanted to kind of stick on that energy level for the rest of the stage. You can't complain too much. You know, this is a very iconic theme from Bionic Commando. It actually only appears in the arcade versions and the home versions that were ports of the arcade version. So I think European gamers who are playing on the European PCs would be much more familiar with this tune than a lot of us North American folks. The game itself was designed by Tokuro Fujiwara, and originally, before this, he had created two significant games that were kind of essential to Bionic Commando's development. First was the original Commando game, and Commando was kind of a prototypical vertical run and gun. You're just a commando dropped into a battlefield and you need to run up the screen, shooting enemies as you go. If you're not familiar with Commando, but you're familiar with Ikari Warriors, it's a very similar kind of game. A little faster than Ikari Warriors and a little more simple in terms of graphics, but it had some neat things like in inclusion to your machine gun. You can also throw grenades, and if you throw grenades in the right spot, you can uncover hidden ladders that will go down into dungeons underneath the level where you can rescue fellow soldiers or get more grenades or points or free guys and stuff. So there was a little bit of depth to the gameplay there. The other game that he designed was an arcade game in 1983 called Rock and Rope. And this was significant because the protagonist's character is able to put down stakes and create diagonal lines that he can climb on to work his way up these vertically stacked levels. He doesn't really have a jumping ability, and he's trying to collect these golden feathers in these cave island kind of levels that are populated by dinosaurs and cavemen and stuff. And so he's kind of shooting these grappling hooks at the cliffs and climbing up them diagonal. And that's a big reference point for Bionic Commando, because Bionic Commando's main mechanic, and I guess thing that sets it apart from most other games, is that your Bionic Commando has a bionic arm by which you can swing around and climb up instead of jumping. So combining the concepts of Commando and Rock and Rope, he kind of smooshed them together and got a commando that could climb on ropes. And that's where Bionic Commando was born. So it was neat to see these two kind of disparate games that you would never think had anything in common with them aside from the game designer, to see both of those concepts kind of get together and create something completely different from both. The game was pretty popular in the arcade. It was popular enough to get a ton of home ports. There were ports for MS-DOS, the Amstrad CPC, the Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum, the Amiga, and the Atari ST. There were actually two versions made for the Commodore 64. There was a North American version released by Capcom, and then a version in the UK, which was ported by Software Creations. The North American version is terrible. It's just not good. The music is not good. The action is super jank. By comparison, the Software Creations version is 10 times better. And not only was it better gameplay-wise and graphically, but the music was done by a composer by the name of Tim Follin. You may have heard of him. He was responsible for creating the soundtracks to all of the PC games. I'm not sure about the MS-DOS version. I'm not sure if there was even music in that version. But I know for a fact the Atari ST, Amiga, ZX Spectrum, and Commodore 64 versions all had soundtracks that were arranged and composed original music by Follin. So there's another kind of melding of two of my favorite things here, Bionic Commando and Tim Follin. So it's pretty cool. Some of the versions, there was an additional level between levels 3 and 4, which featured enemy helicopters. Depending on the amount of memory the game had, that version was either in there or not. And the UK home computer versions were published by US Gold. Another cool fact is that Tim Follin's brother, Mike Follin, his older brother, which actually got him into video games, created the music engines for all of the home versions that Tim composed the music for. Probably leads me to believe that Mike Follin did a lot of the porting and programming of the game itself as well, because he was kind of a one-man development team when he was working on games for European PCs. So, speaking of Tim Follin, I mean, I'm not just going to drop his name and then not play any music from him, of course. We've actually got two tunes from Follin right now. We're going to listen to Infiltration Stage 3 from the Commodore 64 version of Bionic Commando, which was released in 1988, arranged and composed by Tim Follin. Alright, that was Infiltration Stage 3 from the Commodore 64 port of Bionic Commando, released in 1988, composed by Tim Follin. You can easily tell where Tim got tired of doing a direct conversion of the arcade music and just decided to do whatever the hell he wants, which is kind of like what Tim does when he composes. And I think he got so tired of the conversion at the first part of the song that he didn't even loop back to it. Kind of similar to what Fujita did with the Bionic Commando theme. The entire first part of the song is just absent, and instead we get Tim Follin's very solo-heavy bump, 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 bump. You can easily tell that it's him. It sounds very much like the same chords and rhythms that he used in like Spider-Man and X-Men and Arcade's Revenge and Treasure Master and a bunch of that stuff. So it's got Tim Follin's vibe all over it, but then it also starts off with the very traditional Bionic Commando music, so it's a really cool piece of music, and it's a really cool soundtrack as well, because that's kind of what Follin did for this entire soundtrack, and for most of the ports. He'll do his own little take on the actual music itself, and then somewhere along the way he'll just break off and do his own thing. You'll probably be listening to these songs fairly often, so you'll get a good spread of both original arcade tunage and Follin progressive tunage to listen to. I think my favorite part of this song is definitely the secondary part, the first part. So, as I've said, the NES version of the game was my first introduction to this series and remains one of my favorite games of all time. There weren't many musical pieces from the original arcade soundtrack that were brought into the NES version of the game, and the beginning of this tune is the regular Stage 3 music for the arcade version, but for the NES version, a variation on this melody plays while you are playing like a non-traditional style of gameplay in the game, where it's a vertical scrolling top-down commando style action sequence instead of the standard side-scrolling swinging sequence. So it's cool they left a little bit of it in there, and the NES composer put her own spin on that as well, but we'll talk a little bit more about that when we finally get to the NES game. Bionic Commando itself, the original arcade game, takes place about 10 years after this giant world war. What that has to do with the actual game, I don't know, but that's part of the story of the game. When it gets down to the nitty-gritty, there's good guys and bad guys. The bad guys, who they're not really named. There's not a lot of story for the arcade version. You know you are playing as Super Joe, who was the protagonist of the original Commando game. So there's a familiar name there, and now Super Joe has this bionic arm that he can use to swing back and forth, kind of like Tarzan, climb up and attach onto things and kind of stun enemies with. You're fighting through 5 stages of these purple-clad enemies, and at the end, the big bad dude is about to launch some nuclear missiles, which is going to destroy the planet. And in a kind of unique twist for a 1987 arcade game, you can get a good ending or a bad ending, whether you are able to prevent this missile launch from happening or not. So I thought that was pretty cool. There's like an armed bodyguard that you have to defeat before the final boss can finish the launch sequence. If you beat him in time, then you finish the launch sequence, and then you have to beat the final boss in order to get the good ending. If not, well, you know, the world blows up and Super Joe has to hang his head in defeat if he survives the blast. There's no jumping. This is what makes a lot of people upset about this game, or not able to wrap their minds around this game. Most side-scrolling action platformers have a jump button, and I don't blame them for being mad about that fact. I remember on Pixel Tunes, Mike used to constantly dismiss this game because of its lack of a jump button. In my opinion, the bionic arm makes you more maneuverable and more dangerous to your enemy than being able to jump. But I think we'll get more into that when we're talking about the NES version of the game. Before we get there, though, I do want to talk a little bit about the music composer of the original one, Harumi Fujita. But before we get there, let's listen to another Tim Follin composition. This is The Forefront, Stage 2 from the Amiga port of Bionic Commando, again released in 1988, composed by Tim Follin, with a music driver created by his brother Mike. The Forefront Stage 2 from the Amiga version of Bionic Commando, arranged by Tim Follin. This is a very important piece of music in the Bionic Commando series. This is the Bionic Commando theme, more or less. Lots of the games that were to come after this will call back to this melody many times and in many different ways. Ba 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 da da. That whole melody line is synonymous with Bionic Commando, and I can't listen to those notes without thinking about a guy in a green suit with red hair swinging around in very cool Capcom-esque NES stages. This is an uncharacteristically short piece for Tim Follin as well, clocking in at under 1 minute and 30 seconds, and it's very close to the original piece of music as well. There's a little bit towards the end where he kind of diverges. He throws in Luke's theme from Star Wars a little bit in there as well. I guess he thought they sounded similar and just wanted to demonstrate that fact. I thought that was kind of clever and funny. The first time I heard it, I was like, wait, this isn't part of this. Wait, this is Star Wars. What the hell is going on here? So I think that's Tim just being a little bit cheeky, and I appreciate that quite a bit. I think we're fairly well versed on Tim Follin's musical career. If you're not, or if you really enjoyed these couple of pieces and would like to hear more Tim Follin, I will direct you back to my old VGM podcast, Pixel Tunes Radio, in which I did 2 full 2-hour-long episodes on Tim's career, his early career and his later career, on episodes 69 and 96, respectively. So, go check those out. There's a wealth of Tim Follin information. He's also done interviews with Legacy Music Hour, Super Mercado Brothers, a couple of other video game music podcasts. So, there's a lot of information about him, both personally and musically. Anyways, Harumi Fujita was born in 1961 in Osaka. She spent a long time with Capcom and composed music for games like Mad Crasher. I did mention her name as a composer on 1943 Kai, which was kind of like a Capcom all-star composition team that worked on that. Final Fight Strider, Willow, Chippendale Rescue Rangers, Gargoyle's Quest. She wrote some of the soundtrack to Mega Man 3 with Yasuaki Fujita, no relation, Skyblazer, Bishoujo Senshi Sailor Moon S, Todd McFarlane's Spawn, the video game, Polestar, Punky Skunk. She's had a pretty storied career. She worked in games up till around 1999 with Magical Tetris Challenge for the Game Boy Color, and then kind of ducked out for a little bit, and we didn't hear anything from her until 2016. She got a special thanks on Galgun Double Peace, and then wrote the incredible soundtrack to Spider Soars, which is a Apple Arcade game, really cool side-scrolling game that y'all should check out. And I think you can also find the soundtrack to that on the music collection I have on the VGMbassy Discord, so go check that out as well. She also contributed some music to Streets of Rage 4, and, hopefully she'll make some more music in the future, but this was one of her biggest games at the time. It was the fourth game that she worked on, and the mark of a good composition is when other composers keep going back to it and finding new ways to rearrange it and making those melodies kind of indelible and intertwined with the games that they are a part of. So, as we go throughout the show, we might call back to some of Fujita's original pieces. The NES version took some of Fujita's music and rearranged it, but the composer Junko Tamiya also wrote a lot of her own original music for the game. And like I said, this is one of my favorite games of all time, so I'm extremely excited to share some music and to talk about it. So, we're going to start off where it all begins, Area 1 from Bionic Commando, released on the NES in 1988, composed by Junko Tamiya. I'm sure that might have sounded a little bit familiar to you. That was Area 1 from the NES version of Bionic Commando, released in 1988 and composed by Junko Tamiya. As I said before, that Bionic Commando theme, da 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 da. This is the quote-unquote original version that I heard in my youth, and it sounds very similar to Tim Follin's interpretation. Of course, it's a little more militaristic. I think the Bionic Commando tunes for the NES version, Junko really leaned hard into the military style, especially the percussion. It's just a rolling snare. It just feels like the band is marching down the battlefield and playing the song on flutes or, whatever you can imagine at the time. And I love the way that it takes this Bionic Commando theme and transposes it up towards the end, and then it just keeps rising and rising and rising and getting more and more heroic until it finally just reaches its peak, and then you get that little back into the bump. So It's so much fun how she stitched these loops together for a lot of these tunes. And it's difficult for me to talk about this music because I played the game so much and it became so much a part of my childhood. It's impossible to separate the nostalgia from the actual music itself. Like, I can't step away and look at these tunes objectively. However, like I said, when I hear this theme in other songs from more recent titles, it's a blast of nostalgia to the face. And I don't get that feeling from many other video games, except particularly this one. This game was also designed and directed by Tokuro Fujiwara, and he was a very, very successful designer at Capcom. He was responsible for a huge number of Capcom's IPs. He created the Ghosts and Goblins series. He also created the Sweet Home game for the Famicom, which was the basis of today's Resident Evil series. He actually co-created Resident Evil with Shinji Mikami further down the line, and basically pitching Sweet Home as a more modern style title, which he then helped Mikami develop into the Resident Evil series. He was producer and or director on nearly all of the Mega Man titles for the NES, the Game Boy, and the SNES, all the way up to Mega Man X3. He worked on DuckTales, Little Nemo, Street Fighter 2010, The Final Fight, Breath of Fire, Demon's Quest. The list goes on and on and on. If there was a memorable Capcom title released in the 80s or 90s, there's a very good chance that Fujiwara was behind it. And a lot of this was because he was the general manager of the Capcom console games division from 1988 to 1996. So basically any game that Capcom wanted to put out for their consoles had to cross Fujiwara's desk, and he had to approve it. And he had to, influence and make sure that the game was worth playing. And I think a lot of the reason why Capcom was so successful in the 80s and 90s was because of Fujiwara's exacting standards. He was known to be an extremely stringent and not necessarily difficult to work with person, but he had rules, and you needed to follow the rules. And he wasn't up for much compromise. So as long as you put your faith in Fujiwara and trusted his directives and did a good job, you would be on his good side. There was an interview with Shinji Mikami where a good part of the interview was talking about how scared he was of Tokuro Fujiwara, and just that he was such a stern and imposing figure. Anyways, let's move on to our next selection from the NES soundtrack. This one's going to take a little bit of a different turn. This is the Neutral Zone from Bionic Commando, again composed by Junko Tamiya. This one is a little less militaristic, a little more, RPG town. I kind of wanted to show off the different facets of this soundtrack, so I feel this one's a good juxtaposition to the very militaristic, kind of mature sound of Area 1. Simple, short little tune, but I think it's friendly and very sunny feeling. That's the Neutral Zone from Bionic Commando, composed by Junko Tamiya for the NES. I want to talk a little bit about the differences between the NES version and the arcade version, because there are a ton. I mean, the games, aside from the bionic arm, have hardly any similarities at all. And the neutral zone is one of the major ones. So the game itself is non-linear. So in the arcade version, you've got 5 stages. The levels are kind of set up like Sonic's levels, in that you have to get from the left side of the map to the right side of the map, but there are different routes that you can take to get from point A to point B. And the bionic arm facilitates this pretty easily, because you can climb upward pretty rapidly as long as, you're not climbing directly up into an enemy which is directly above you. You get through 5 stages in the arcade game, boom, missile launch, missile doesn't launch, you get one of your endings, you're done. Start off in the NES version. In A, you've got a long story. You've got a pretty decent sized cutscene setting the game up before you even get to the title screen. And then after you get to the title screen and hit start and begin your game, you have a codec conversation, more or less, very similar to Metal Gear, where you're being introduced to a agent named MA1, and he's going to kind of be able to contact you from these radio towers as you go throughout the game, and you're going to have a helicopter, and the helicopter's going to do what you tell it to, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, this is a lot more complicated than the arcade version, and for good reason. This game really kind of lets you tailor your gameplay to your comfort zone, which was kind of neat for a game back then. You're presented with a map of squares, each with numbers in them, and those numbers are all levels that you can play. There are vertical, horizontal, and diagonal lines connecting these squares. And you have a helicopter, and you tell the helicopter to, you basically point it in the direction you want to go, you hit the A button, the helicopter flies from one place to the other. Once you get there, you could choose to descend and essentially play that particular level, or you can choose to move to a different area. And some of the areas are levels where you're attacking the enemy, and they're shooting at you and, blah, blah, blah. Other areas are called neutral zones, and that's where this music plays. And neutral zones are peaceful areas. You're told right off the bat that if you shoot while you're in a neutral zone, there will be consequences. So in this area, you can talk to townsfolk. It's still a side-scrolling, you still have your bionic arm, you can still swing back and forth. The areas are like, maybe 3 television screens wide, and they're all basically identical to each other. There's 2 doors that you can go into, each of which connects to an identical-looking room with some platforms and some spikes on the bottom. But depending on which neutral zone you enter into, these rooms might have different items. So you might get a pack of flares, which you can use for another level, which is completely dark, which allows you to light the way, and you might pick up these communicators, which are extremely important because throughout all of the levels that you're playing through, you enter into these communication rooms, which I mentioned briefly before. And these communication rooms allow you to talk to your team members, and they will give you hints about what's coming up later in the level, or just kind of give you a little exposition about the story and how things are going. And it also allows you to wiretap the enemy so that you can hear what the enemy is doing. And sometimes they'll be talking to each other and insulting each other, and there's a little bit of humor thrown in as well. So already you can tell it's pretty deep, and couple that with the fact that you can make this helicopter go more or less anywhere you want it to, means you have your freedom to pick your starting level, you have your freedom to collect which items you want from each of these neutral zones to be able to bring into the levels. In my experience with lots of casual players of Bionic Commando, everybody's got their own kind of route that they take to get from the beginning of the game to the end. It gets the pathing gets a little more narrow towards the end, but at the beginning there are several different ways that you can go. And as you fly your helicopter, there are little trucks that run around on this map too. When your helicopter meets a truck, you're forced to descend. And I talked a little bit before about the different action sequences which are top-down vertically scrolling. That's when you would play those. And if you're good and you defeat some of the more difficult enemies in those top-down vertical scrolling action sequences, you get these little winged icons, and those are continues. And you can collect, I think, up to 9 continues. So if you're good at those sequences, you can get yourself a whole bunch of dudes to be able to play through this pretty difficult game. So that's kind of that area of gameplay in a nutshell. Junko Tamiya adapted 2 of the original arcade tracks, the Bionic Commando theme, which we just heard from, and the power plant, and the original music that she added became kind of like the canon soundtrack for the series. Like a lot of the tunes that were in the original arcade version, especially that Area 1 Forest song, you don't really hear from at all in the more modern games. I'd say, most of the music from the series going forward is based on either very tightly or very loosely from the NES version of the soundtrack. So I think Junko Tamiya had probably the most influence on Bionic Commando music, much more so than Harumi Fujita did. We're going to listen to one more song from the Bionic Commando NES game. We're going to listen to the track from Area 8. When we get back, we're going to talk a little bit about the differences, and there are major differences between the North American NES version of the game and the Japanese Famicom version of the game, and maybe a little bit more about the gameplay as well. Probably my favorite piece of music from the NES version of the game, that was Area 8, composed by Junko Tamiya. And I don't know what the genre is. It feels like surf rock, but kind of a very Monsters kind of surf rock. There's kind of a darkness to it, I think, especially towards the end when the rolling snare comes in and it gets a little more militaristic. It's almost like, what was that old movie, Surf Nazis Must Die or something like that? It feels like this could be a piece of music from that cult movie. I mean, Nazis do appear in this game in more than one form, so I certainly doubt that Tamiya was going for that, but I think that's kind of cool. Later on in the show, and I'll probably play this track, at least a snippet of this track again for direct comparison, but Simon Viklund does an amazing remake of this tune for Bionic Commando Rearmed, and there's especially a part in the B section where I feel like he takes a segment of this song and reimagines it into something that just sounds so amazing to me. So I'm excited to share that. Stay tuned for it as we go throughout the show. As I mentioned briefly, for the release of the international version of the game, all references to Nazism in the text and the imagery was removed for the English localization. The enemy in the Japanese version was originally a neo-Nazi nation, and the army's insignia was like a swastika with a thunderbolt behind it. In the English version, they changed the Nazis to the Bads, B-A-D-D-S, and I thought that was kind of funny. The instruction booklet for the North American version refers to the Bads as the Knots, or Naz, N-A-Z-Z. Maybe that was the original version of the bad guy's name, and they thought it was still too similar to Nazi, so they did a last-minute code change to Bads, but weren't able to change the instruction booklet fast enough. They took out the swastika, they replaced it with kind of Albanian eagle-looking thing. The leader of the villains, who was originally called Wiseman, was renamed Kilt, K-I-L-L-T, and I don't know, maybe Wiseman was too German-sounding. They wanted to kind of distance themselves as much as possible. They tweaked the difficulty, which they usually do for Japanese versus American. I think the Japanese version was a little on the easier side, and I think they made the North American version a little more difficult. The major difference is that, of course, the leader of the Nazis would have been Hitler, and so it was actually a resurrected Hitler in the Japanese Famicom version of the game. They renamed him to Master D in the North American version. However, they didn't change his character sprite. He still looks exactly like Hitler. It's like, you look at the dude and you're like, well, I know who you say you are, but I know who you are. There's a ending sequence. It's a, kind of a meme-ish kind of an ending sequence right before the final gameplay scene of the game, where Hitler / Master D's face explodes, and it's funny. I think it would be more satisfying to see Hitler's face exploding than Master D's face exploding, even if they look the same. Just, knowing it was actually him would be cooler. But yeah, the game is super fun. I stumbled upon it kind of by accident. My brother and I, originally, the original Commando for the NES was the second NES game that he and I ever owned. We had been getting super tired of playing Super Mario Brothers over and over again for several months, being the only NES game in our collection at the time, aside from Duck Hunt, which, there's not a lot of content in that title. So we begged my mom to go to the store and buy a new video game. We must have bugged her enough because she decided to do so. We got there, and I don't know, we just looked at a bunch of boxes, not knowing much about anything because we didn't have Nintendo Power or anything at that point. I don't even think it existed. And I guess we settled on Commando. This was around 86, I think. So 2 years later, he and I are at Blockbuster trying to look for a game to rent for the weekend, and we see Bionic Commando on the shelf, and I'm like, well, it's made by Capcom. Those are the same guys that made Commando, and it's referencing this character, Super Joe, on the back of the box, and I know he was the protagonist of Commando, so I don't know, let's try Bionic Commando. Maybe it's cool. So we brought it home. I started playing it. I had no idea what I was doing because it was so non-linear. Like, I had 2 or 3 years of experience with the NES up to that point, but never having a game like that where you can choose from like 9 different levels to play at the outset of the game, and not having a packed-in instruction manual. I was just kind of like flying in the dark, and I would just wander around these kind of non-linear stages, wondering if there was an end, wondering if this was just a series of levels that you would drop into and wander around in until you died. Like, I couldn't figure out what the hell I was doing, and I remember on the end of the 3rd day, before I had to bring the game back to Blockbuster, my last play session, I finally found the end to one of the levels. And you get into this room, and there's generally an enemy there, and there's a big kind of generator on the right wall, and you have to get past the enemy from left to right and destroy the generator. And I don't think I was able to destroy the generator, but I remember at that point I was like, okay, I know these levels are finite. I know there is a way to beat these levels. And it was like just at that revelation that my mom was like, all right, get in the car, we got to go back to Blockbuster and return this stuff. And I was like, no. And I think that's what really cemented this as being something that I wanted to conquer. So generally what we did as kids is make a list of all the games that we've rented that we enjoyed that we want to add to our collection. And then my birthday is in October, and then obviously Christmas is in December, so towards the end of the year, we would kind of let our parents and grandparents know which games we've played over the year that we would, like to receive as gifts. And, we didn't necessarily get all of them, of course, but we would get a few of them, and I was lucky enough that adding Bionic Commando to that list meant that I received it for Christmas that year, and through just kind of picking up where I left off and learning how to play the game, I was able to get really, really good at it and started to really, really enjoy it. It's a game worth playing, and if you haven't tried it out, I really recommend you do so. It's got a very cool art style. It's kind of like near-future militaristic. Everything's very brutalesque architecture. There's not a lot of shading. It's just cool. I wish I had more time. Like, I would spend an entire episode on this game. I could talk about this game forever. And if you're interested, I would totally love to discuss it on social media with you guys. Suffice to say, a brief rundown of the story is that your country is at war with the bads. Contrary to the first arcade version, instead of you being Super Joe, the government sends Super Joe behind enemy lines to try to take down Master D. Super Joe gets kidnapped, so they send you in, and you have many different names. I guess your official name is Rad, R-A-D. However, in the game itself, you are referred to as Ladd, L-A-D-D. And I think, of course, that was an L-R Japanese mistransliteration. You were supposed to be Rad the whole time, but the phonetic pronunciation was Ladd. So your name is Nathan Rad Spencer. You are outfitted with a bionic arm, and you are sent into the same enemy territory that Super Joe went into to try to get him back. About 3/4 of the way through the game, you finally meet up with Joe, you rescue him, and then together you work in concert to take down the bads and Hitler/Master D and their plans for world domination. So, fantastic game, really good ending, very rewarding to beat this game, which is why I like to do so over and over again. Great use of exposition and story through these communication rooms and through characters that you can talk to in the neutral zone. Most side-scrolling action games on the NES around that time did not have a lot of exposition and storyline, and this one had a great concurrent storyline going along with it. So I think that helped draw me in to the story of the Bionic Commando universe as well. So after the NES game was released, there was a 4-year pause in Bionic Commando history until the Game Boy port of Bionic Commando was released in 1992, and the game is very similar but has a different soundtrack. It's got some similarities and some differences. Some of it sounds a little more enhanced, like enhanced versions of the NES soundtrack. It was composed by Koji Murata. It did not have as many pieces of music, but what's there is still very good. So we're going to listen to areas 4, 6, 8, and 17. We're not listening to 4 pieces of music. This is one piece of music that plays in 4 different stages from the Bionic Commando port to the Game Boy, which was released in 1992. you're listening to the super sexy, swingin' sounds of Bionic Commando here on VGMbassy. That was areas 4, 6, 8, and 17 from the Game Boy port of Bionic Commando released in 1992 and composed by Koji Murata. This is an original piece of music that he wrote for the game. It's not one of the ported pieces from Harumi Fujita or Junko Tamiya, and I love it. It's hard rockin', just real gritty Game Boy pulse channel chords, kind of freaking out, and it adds so much energy to the gameplay, I think. And there's this really cool heroic part just before the loop, and then that very last part that kind of brings it into the loop really reminds me of like a Ninja Turtles game or something, especially like maybe Ninja Turtles 3 or the first Game Boy Ninja Turtles. The rest of it, I think, has a very Iku Mizutani, Natsume kind of feel. Very hard rock, chiptune stuff. A great, great fit for this series. This Game Boy game is very similar to the NES version, and honestly, I didn't play it that much because I'm not a big handheld gamer, and I didn't really even try to go back to it until fairly recently. And I noticed that the graphics are kind of more similar to the arcade version, but the gameplay and the maps and the level designs are more similar to the NES. So it's kind of a moosh between the two. It's also been kind of updated graphically so that everything is super futuristic, whereas, like I said, on the NES, it had kind of just this brutalist architecture. Everything is kind of looks slapped together with metal panels and girders and beams and, you know, bolts on like square panels attaching everything together. This one's got very rounded edges and almost kind of like a military meets the Jetsons kind of flair to it. So if you like that kind of aesthetic, you might want to check out the Game Boy Bionic Commando version instead of the NES. It's a little more stiff in terms of gameplay, like these swinging mechanics I feel were mastered on the NES. Of course, that's the version I grew up with, so that would be my de facto physics engine, I guess you could say. It's a little more janky on the Game Boy version, but still perfectly playable. It really follows the same plot as the NES version. It just, like I said, sets it into a futuristic setting instead of a current day. You are, again, Rad Spencer, but you're an agent of the FF Corps instead of the FF Battalion in the NES version. And your mission, of course, is to rescue your ally Super Joe from the Doraise army and prevent their leader, Director Wiseman, who you might remember from the Famicom version of the Bionic Commando title, enacting his secret Albatross plan. So there's not too much different. They just kind of got even further away from the whole Nazi thing. They kind of turned Wiseman into the de facto enemy instead of just a general where Master D, aka Hitler, was going to be the final dude. There's also some more cinema-like opening and ending sequences. I mean, there was a pretty good cutscene at the beginning of the NES version, but this one even kind of adds more flair and flavor and exposition to the whole thing. And there's a lot of large full-screen character artwork for Rad and Super Joel and everyone. So it's got more visual story, whereas the NES version had more text-based story. Other than that, I think there's a lot more in common between the two games than different between the two games if you get over the obvious difference in graphics. We're going to listen to one more track from the Game Boy version before we start talking about the composer. This is the enemy attack theme from the Game Boy port of Bionic Commando, again composed by Koji Murata. another rockin' tune from Bionic Commando on the Game Boy. That was Enemy Attack, composed by Koji Murata. This is the song that plays if you accidentally fire your weapon in the neutral zone, and then you get attacked by the military police. And it feels pretty intense. It still has kind of like a surf rock kind of a vibe going on. I think it's not so super intense because the military police is just... It's more like, hey, you shouldn't have fired here. We're gonna kind of run around and pretend we're dangerous. And you can, like, pretty easily just fly right out of the level as soon as they pop up if you've accidentally hit, like, your B button while you're in the neutral zone. Sometimes there's a roadblock or something in the neutral zone that you literally have to fire your weapon to remove it. And so you're kind of stuck in this situation where it's like, well, I can't go any further without firing, so it kind of forces the military police to come and try to attack you. So you're going to hear the song at least once throughout the gameplay in the game, even if you're super careful in that neutral zone. Like I said, otherwise you just kind of glide on through, and it's more of an exposition kind of a level and a picking up communication stuff kind of deal. There was one major design flaw in the NES version, which they corrected in this version and all versions going forward, and that's in-stage inventory management. So the game has these colored communicators, and they are designated by kind of crudely drawn Greek characters, which I didn't even know what they were when I was first playing this game. They were just kind of like random symbols that meant these, but they don't really associate the symbols with the colors in the game, so you don't really know which one is which, and if you go into a level while you're carrying the wrong color communicator, you just get garbage when you try to use the communicator inside the level. You know, every level has at least one communications door that you can go into and get messages from your allies or your enemies, and in some levels towards the end of the game, the door at the end of the stage won't unlock if you don't bring the right communicator and listen to the message. The other ones, mostly, they will open even if you get the garbage message from getting the wrong communicator. So in the Game Boy game and going forward, if you have the wrong communicator equipped, you can back out of the communicator control panel, select the correct communicator, and then go back in, and that made it a heck of a lot easier. So that's one of the things I did like about the Game Boy Bionic Commando, and how it took measures to improve the player experience. You know, lots of quality of life improvements. Anyways, a little bit about Koji Murata, because I wasn't really familiar with him, and I guess he was a freelancer employed by Minakuchi Engineering, and they didn't necessarily work on their own games, but they kind of were hired out to work on parts of games. So I thought that was interesting. He was not a Capcom employee, which is why, you know, his name is not synonymous with a lot of the other composers that we've heard from so far. He started working for Tosei in the early 80s and then moved over to Konami, and in the 90s he started working for Capcom. While he was at Tosei, he worked on games like Bases Loaded 1 and 2 and Tenka no Goikenban Mito Koman. He also worked at Freak Limited as an instrument repairman, which I thought was interesting. So not only was he a audio sound programmer and a composer, but he also obviously probably knew how to play several instruments if he was able to repair them, or at least had a working knowledge of how they worked. His game music career started in 1986 when he started working for Tosei, but he wasn't credited in any of their games since the company didn't believe in giving credit to them. So he also has his own website set up, but it's all in Japanese, but on his website he has his work history, and a lot of these games were listed as his works, and that's how people have come to be able to credit him for these games. While he was working for Konami, he arranged Rob Hubbard's music for the original Skate or Die game, which I owned as a kid and love the music in that game. He worked on Ganbare Goemon 2, which had an amazing soundtrack, and the Famicom Disk System arrangement of Castlevania 2's soundtrack, which I thought was interesting. He left there in 1989 and went to work as a freelance composer, where he started working on some Konami games. He worked for Yoshidama Workshop Company as a composer from 1995 to 2010, and he currently works as the executive producer at Groovebit. He was not only a composer, though. In addition to repairing instruments and programming, he also developed his own sound drivers. So all of the games that he worked on for Minakuchi Engineering, he created his own Game Boy sound driver. And while at Tosei, this was far enough back where they didn't really have great sound drivers, so all of the music for the NES he had to write in 6502 assembly. So he knows his way around assembly language, that's for sure. His most recent credit was a project manager on Kingdom Hearts Unchained X in 2016. So that was a pretty big name game, so maybe he's still floating around in the video game scene somewhere. We just haven't seen many credits for him lately. I thought that was neat, I thought that was a cool introduction to a composer who was making some really rockin' tunes that nobody really talks about too much, and he's a cool part of Bionic Commando history. There was one more Game Boy Bionic Commando game released. This one was an exclusive to the Game Boy Color. It was released in 2000 and called Bionic Commando Elite Forces. The interesting thing about this title is that it was developed and published by Nintendo. Capcom didn't really have anything to do with it. And it was composed by a gentleman by the name of Lawrence Schwelder. But to start off, we're going to listen to Area 2-2 from Bionic Commando Elite Forces. It goes places. That was Area 2-2 from Bionic Commando Elite Forces, released on the Game Boy Color in 2000, composed by Lawrence Schwelder. This piece of music is like a staircase. It just builds and builds and builds, and it gets cooler with every single build. And it feels like for a sound chip with 5 total sound channels to start off sounding decently full, but to be able to build on that over and over again with such a limited sound palette, I thought was a real testament to his talents as a composer. By the end, the song feels really, really full and really cool, especially with those backing arpeggios. They're just kind of relentlessly driving. So, fun song. The general melody in this song is kind of like the motif by which a lot of the other songs base their melodies on. So I wanted to kind of choose this because it featured the motif melody most up front, of all of the rest of the songs on the soundtrack. Elite Forces wasn't only the first Bionic Commando game not published by Capcom and published by Nintendo, but it was also the first title from the Nintendo Software Technology Studio, which was based in Redmond, Washington, at Nintendo of America's headquarters. It's considered a direct sequel to the Game Boy version of the game, and it only came out in North America and Australia at first, and didn't see a European release until 2014, when it came out on the 3DS Virtual Console. To this date, this game has not come out in Japan, which I thought was really interesting. The art style is very not Japanese, and the cinematic scenes at the beginning of the game almost feel like they're digitized hand paintings, but kind of, lowered in quality to the Game Boy Color standards. But they're really nice looking, and the colors really pop, even on, bigger screens like the Game Boy Player, or if you're playing on a emulator or something. The artwork is actually really nice. The action in the game is kind of zoomed in, so the characters are a lot bigger than I would have expected from a game like this. And there's pros and cons to that. There's a lot of detail in the characters. The animation is really, really good. And like I said, the rest of the art is all really nice. The background art is super good. But being so closed in, it's kind of difficult to see where you're swinging to. And there's a lot of foresight issues where you're not able to kind of see enough of what's going on around you to make educated guesses about where you should be going and if there's things that you need to dodge or be aware of or something. So, Game Boy limitations. I can see they wanted to impress people with the animation and the artwork, but they had to sacrifice some of that visibility in the game to make it all work. You play as a member of the peaceful land of Carinia, and the land is being terrorized by an evil man named Arturus. He commands an army called the Avars, and they've terrorized Carinia for years. So one day they receive a kind of garbled communication from Commander Joe, most likely Super Joe. Maybe he's a commander now. Maybe this takes place in the future. Who knows? Anyways, he had infiltrated their territory, and his communication basically says that Arturus was planning to launch the Albatross project, which that's a commonality among all of the games, is this Albatross. So the Bionic Corps contacted the Elite Forces to help stop the Avars, prevent the fall of Carinia, and rescue Joe. Plot-wise, it's really similar to the original Bionic Commando. Go in there, rescue Joe, and then help him defeat the big bad guys. They've changed the orientation of all the characters in the game enough to even further remove itself from all of the original Nazi imagery. The Albatross plan is usually, a plan to resurrect a long-dead dictator, but in this game, Project Albatross was the revival of a wrecked space vessel that can give its owner mutant powers. So that's a little hint about what the final boss in this game is all about. The other neat thing is that you can play as either a male commando or a female commando, both of which play pretty much the same as far as movement and bionicking goes. Yes, I'm turning into a verb. There are a few differences in their weapons, where the male commando will get an assault rifle, the female one gets a particle gun, and instead of a rocket launcher, the female commando gets a pulse cannon. So maybe you might prefer one or the other. All in all, it's a really fun game. My only gripe is the zoomed in camera, and that the art is so colorful and complex that it's much easier playing on a big screen TV than it is trying to play on a handheld. Or if you're playing it on a handheld, one of those updated, super bright LED screens will definitely go a long way in helping you navigate this game correctly. But as a first-made game from Nintendo Software Technology as their freshman outing, it's an incredible game and really fun to play. It's a really good addition to the Bionic Commando universe. We're going to listen to one more track from the game and then talk a little bit about Lawrence Schwelder when we come back from that. This is Area 3, again from Bionic Commando Elite Forces, released on the Game Boy Color in 2000. God, I really love that tune. That was Area 3 from Bionic Commando Elite Forces, released on the Game Boy Color in 2000, composed by Lawrence Schwelder. Another real rockin' tune. There's so much good music in the Bionic Commando series that people just overlook. I love this because it really reminds me of like Sid or Razor's themes from George Sanger's Maniac Mansion soundtrack, with the really nice rhythm guitar chords underneath with the square channel guitar lead over it, kind of squealing away. It has a lot of that feel to it, and I'd be surprised if Lawrence Schwelder wasn't somehow influenced by that or hadn't at least been aware of George Sanger's NES music before composing this. I think the similarities there are way too similar, for lack of a better word, for it to be kind of a coincidence, but you never know. Lawrence Schwelder was an audio director for Nintendo Software Technology. He was there until 2012, when he went to go work for DigiPen, which was kind of like a Nintendo-adjacent software development school, where he designed degree programs in the music and sound design department. Elite Forces was his first game with Nintendo. He wrote the soundtrack, and that was it. He was just the composer, but after that, he became audio director on the Game Boy Color port of Crystallis a year later, and then he was director or audio support on almost every game he worked on thereafter, so I guess he got promoted immediately after doing this. He worked on Ridge Racer 64, Pokemon Puzzle League, the Mario vs. Donkey Kong games 1 and 2, Metroid Prime Hunters, and both Rhythm Heaven and Rhythm Heaven Fever games, in inclusion to a whole bunch of other Nintendo first-party titles. Mostly handheld-based games, with the exception of a couple of Nintendo 64 games here and there. So I thought that was really cool to start off as a Game Boy Color video game composer and immediately start directing people and, telling people what your vision for the final game is going to be. I thought that was really neat, especially when you're put on games featuring like Pokemon, Mario, Samus, all of the big, not that Samus was really in Metroid Prime Hunters, but at least the pedigree of the game was in high esteem, although maybe that game wasn't in high esteem, but you know what I mean. Anyways, so we didn't get too much more composition from Lawrence Schwelder after this. He did contribute a track or two to games like Ridge Racer 64 and Pokemon Puzzle League, but we never got another full soundtrack again, which is a shame. There's a lot of really good stuff in here, and I would love to hear some other compositions that he would have, maybe put together for other games that he worked on. Alright, so from the original Game Boy Bionic Commando, released in '92, to Elite Forces in 2000, was an 8-year span. That was a long time. It's almost like Nintendo and Capcom just wait until people have forgotten about Bionic Commando, and then they're like, hey, remember this series? We got a new game. And it happened again. After the 2000 release of Elite Forces, there was not another game in the Bionic Commando series until 2008, again 8 years later, with Bionic Commando Rearmed. People, listen. You may not enjoy this soundtrack as much as I do, but this soundtrack is one of my favorite pieces of music ever put to speakers and put inside my brain. Of all video game music in existence, I probably have listened to this soundtrack the most. It's gritty, it's electronic. I know a lot of you guys aren't totally into this stuff, but hopefully you'll be able to appreciate it for what it is, and if you're into the same kind of music that I'm into, maybe you'll enjoy it just as much if you're not familiar. So, yeah, we're going to start off with Power Plant from Bionic Commando Rearmed. This was released, again, in 2008 on the PC, Xbox 360, and PS3, composed by the producer of the game, Simon Viklund. Hold on to your bionic butts.
They lost their hero to the enemy. They went looking for the perfect soldier to rescue him. They found some guy who couldn't even jump. Let me tell you about the man I met when I was young.
Mr. Joe, I'm here to rescue you.
This year, a new hero will rise. A mechanical arm will extend. And heads...
Your number's up, monster!
will explode.
Get the heck out of here, you nerd! Joining up behind him! Dog of the Federation! I'm not gonna make it! I will take over your army and rule the world.
Just when you thought 2D gaming was over and done, it's brought back to life. As if it was a long-dead World War II dictator resurrected by a madman as part of a plan for world domination.
Self-destruction sequence activated.
2 times the action. 2 times the excitement. 2/3 the dimensions. Bionic Commando Rearmed. For the fans, by a bunch of other fans.
How y'all doing? That was Power Plant from Bionic Commando Rearmed, released in 2008 on the PC, Xbox 360, and PS3, composed by Simon Viklund, a absolutely incredible reinterpretation of one of my favorite songs from the NES soundtrack. You might recall I played the song as Area 8 earlier in the show, and there's a segment that I absolutely love. It's around 54 seconds in, and it takes what I always thought was kind of a, circusy Calliope style rhythm in the game, and turned it into just this badass electronic riff. And I'm gonna play them back to back right now, just so you can see what I'm talking about. Isn't that just so cool? I love his reinterpretations of these tunes, and I love how the beginning of the NES song is kind of unique sounding, but he decided to turn it into kind of like klaxons at the beginning of the Rearmed tune. There's so many little touches where I could tell that he was just as familiar with this music as I was when he did the remixes. And God, I felt so validated when Rearmed was announced, because not a lot of other people really knew about it. So I'd always wished that Bionic Commando had come out on the SNES. I didn't really care too much about the two Game Boy games because, again, not a handheld guy. I didn't really even count them that much. I was like, I just wanted a main series on TV console game that I could play, and I thought the SNES would have been able to handle it really well. And so it was ages and ages and ages, and they were like, yeah, Bionic Commando, hey, we're making a 3D Bionic Commando game, like a AAA title, to come out on the Xbox 360 and the PS3. And as an aside, we're also creating Bionic Commando Rearmed, and it's going to be a full-on HD remake of the original Bionic Commando game, and I nearly pooped my pants. I was like, this is my dream come true. Like, Mike Levy gets with Castlevania, this was me. Now I know how people get crazy when they announce a new Metroid or a Castlevania, because they announced a new Bionic Commando, and I didn't know what to do with myself. So I followed the news on the game religiously, and the cool thing about the producer of the game and the composer being the same dude, Simon Viklund, on the Bionic Commando Rearmed website, which was part of the major Capcom site, he would release snippets of his music as he was composing it, and you would get little MP3 downloads of the game music. And I just remember every time he would upload a new piece of music to listen to, I was like, this is so good. It stayed true to the NES melodies, but it was done in one of my favorite musical styles of all time, and he just blended them so freaking well. Good vibes all around, to put it very lightly. The game was a lot of fun. They kept a lot of the stuff in from the original, but they also made things a little bit different. They added a couple new cool features where In the NES game, you could come upon these barrels. You could attach your bionic arm to the barrel and you can kind of slide towards it, but it was very stationary and kind of like attached to the ground. In the remake, you could take these barrels and fling them over your head with your bionic arm and throw them at your enemies. So there were a few bosses where in the NES title, you would just have to either dodge them and shoot out the generator behind it or just keep shooting it until it was dead. In the remake, you would have these barrels that would kind of like topple down from a building above you, and you would have to launch these barrels at the enemy to kill it. So the little changes here and there that kind of varied the gameplay a bit, I thought was really cool. Of course, the great soundtrack, the graphics were phenomenal. It was all in all a very respectful and very fun update to the original game. And I remember being online and seeing this was like the days before Twitter, or at least the days before I was even on it, but just on forums and the comments in video game websites where people were like, I've always loved Bionic Commando, I can't wait for this game to come out. And I was like, oh my god, I can't believe other people liked the same game I did. I always just thought it was this rare, obscure game that nobody really paid attention to, that just happened to be occupy the softest spot of my heart. But it was really fun seeing the gaming community kind of go crazy over something that I was passionate about for a while. I haven't played it in a while, but I'm now talking about it, I want to go back and play through it again. I do have it on Steam, which is great because my Xbox 360 that I originally played it on is long dead from its lovely red rings. So maybe I'll take on the Bads and Master D once again. The other cool thing about it is there's VR missions built into it too, so you can play through these wireframe kind of levels, but it's essentially new content and new ways that you can use your bionic arm. So that was fun too, because I was used to just playing the same levels over and over again. Anyways, we're going to play one more track from Bionic Commando Rearmed before we talk a little bit about Mr. Simon Viklund, and this one's called Rise of the Albatross. It's one of the later stage themes, again, from Bionic Commando Rearmed, released in 2008. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Rise of the Albatross from Bionic Commando Rearmed, released in 2008, composed by Simon Viklund. I love this song. It's pretty long, but it's so good, and it just builds and builds and builds. I like it because, I don't even need to compare it to the original NES version for you guys, because the first iteration of the song's melody is pretty close to how it appears on the NES, and you can immediately tell where he's like, "Yup, I'm yanking this tune and I'm making it my own." It's funny how much of a parallel it is between what Tim Follin did on the European microcomputer games to what he's doing here, probably without even being purposeful. It was just, I'm going to play your song with maybe a couple of flourishes of my own, and then boom, it's going full techno. I don't care what you say. and it's a 5-minute long jam. So this song plays towards the end of the game where you are just about to kind of get ready to blow up the enemy base. And I think the build-up in this song is definitely a good accompaniment to where this game ends up. If you haven't heard the rest of the soundtrack and you enjoy this, please go check it out. You can find playlists on YouTube. I might have it in my soundtrack collection on Discord. If I don't and you want it, let me know and I will put it up. I will probably put it up in the Xbox 360 section, since that seems to be the most popular platform for the game. And yeah, just keep listening to it. Like I said, I've listened to this soundtrack so much, especially when the game first came out around 2008. My oldest son, Eddie, was around 3-4 years old, and we would play this in the car everywhere we went. My wife and I loved this soundtrack, so this was kind of like the music that he grew up on. And one of the tunes from this soundtrack was my ringtone on my phone for years and years and years and years and years. So now every time he hears that song, he just habitually yells, "Daddy, cell phone song!" So it's cool that it's kind of ingrained in his mind just because of how much we listened to it back then. Also, if you like this, you should check out Simon Viklund's other works. A lot of it is very, very similar. Of course, not aping the melodies of the original Bionic Commando game, but his own original stuff is just as good. He was born in Stockholm, Sweden in 1979. He learned to play violin and piano at a young age, and also did some singing, and got into computer tracking with Fast Tracker 2 on the Amiga in his teens. So, as he grew older, he had a friend, Ulf Anderson, who founded a game company called Grin, and he went to go work for them as a composer and sound designer. So, with Grin, he started on their very first game, Ballistics, in 2001, and then Bandits Phoenix Rising in 2002. He was sound designer on Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter and Warfighter 2, both made by Grin. And he was promoted to creative director on Bionic Commando Rearmed, as well as composer of the soundtrack. The Bionic Commando, which we'll be hearing from shortly, which came out a year later in 2009, he was senior sound designer and music consultant, and then did sound design on Wanted Weapons of Fate and Terminator Salvation. When Grin ended up going bankrupt at the end of 2009, he temporarily found employment at Capcom, doing remixes in a similar style of the Final Fight music for the Final Fight Double Impact title that they released for the Xbox Live Arcade, which is a really good soundtrack as well. You should check that out. And then Bionic Commando Rearmed 2 was a bit of a different story, but I think we'll save that story for when we actually play some music for it at the end of the show. He went on to work on some of the additional music for the online edition of Street Fighter III Third Strike for Capcom, and then really got his name known in AAA game circles with the Payday games. He was composer, sound designer, and creative director of Payday the Heist. He was also the voice of Bane, who was the narrator and one of the main characters in the game. And this was done by Overkill Software, which was basically like Grin Part 2. It was founded by Ulf Andersson and Simon Viklund himself. So he was a similar position as well as chief engineer on Payday 2. His latest games have been Dead by Daylight, where he was the composer, and most recently the composer, game designer, and narrative director on GTFO, which came out in 2019. So hopefully he's got some more stuff on the way. Most of his soundtracks have that same gritty electronic style, so you'll hear a little bit more at the end of the show when we listen to some music from Bionic Commando Rearmed 2. But since we're going in chronological order, let's turn our attention to Bionic Commando. I hate when they do remakes or completely different versions years later and name it the same as the original game. Like, maybe I'll just call this Bionic Commando 2009 for delineation's sake. I don't know. This was a game with an interesting soundtrack. 2009 AAA titles, that was around the time where video game music soundtracks were very cinematic sounding. So these tunes might not grab you as much as the other ones do. I still think they're really good. I just wanted to give you some of that context before we started listening to them, so if you feel like it's maybe missing something in that VGM department, you wouldn't be wrong. So maybe listen to them with your film soundtrack ears on, and you might find something different in them. Anyways, we're going to listen to Groder's Anthem from Bionic Commando 2009, composed by Jamie Christopherson. Alright, that was Groder's Anthem from Bionic Commando 2009, released on the PC, Xbox 360, and PS3, composed by Jamie Christopherson. If you're paying close attention, I'm sure you'd recognize this song leans pretty hard on the bass riffs of that Area 8/Power Plant tune, which we just listened to. And builds more of its own unique kind of melody off of that. Doesn't visit too much of the NES music. So I wonder if that's why Simon Viklund was a musical consultant on this game, to kind of manage and make sure that Jamie Christopherson was incorporating elements of the original Bionic Commando themes into his more film score-like video game soundtrack. It makes a lot of sense to me that that would be something that happens, considering that Simon was so familiar with the Bionic Commando themes and Christopherson might not have been. You know, he was probably hired on more for his skills at creating symphonic video game soundtracks than for his familiarity with Bionic Commando. All in all, though, this is a cool tune. It's very evil. It's got a very kind of dark side of the Force, Darth Vader kind of a feel, and I dig it. The game itself is a very dark and gritty game too, and it's very much, I think, a product of its time, where they just wanted to make things as depressing as possible. I don't know. So it takes place after the original Bionic Commando game, and Nathan Rad Spencer has been in prison for quite a while. He was stripped of his bionic arm, and he was basically taken out of prison so that he can go and try to save the world again. Super Joe is now a kind of government lackey operative. We find out his real name is Joe Gibson, and he kind of becomes Spencer's handler throughout the game. He kind of communicates with him via a headset, so you hear him kind of guiding you through the game. Spencer himself is voiced by Mike Patton of Mr. Bungle and Faith No More fame, who is a fantastic singer, and his voice control is fantastic, and he's really, really good at screaming and doing crazy wild sounds. I feel like he's really, really underutilized in this game. Spencer's lines are very simple. He only speaks like 2 or 3 words at a time. I'm like, why did you get a person like Mike Patton, who's known for dynamic voice work, to do one of the blandest parts I've ever seen in a video game? I don't know. Anyways, the whole concept is that the world started to believe that bionically enhanced soldiers were going crazy and were a threat to society, and therefore bionics were considered illegal, which is why Spencer was thrown in prison and basically his arm was taken off. So in a lot of Bionic Commando games, it will show, depending on the artwork, depending on the country that the game was released in, and depending on the artwork, sometimes Spencer has 2 organic arms with a bionic arm kind of attached to the wrist of one of the arms, or kind of wrapped around it. In other pieces of art, he has 1 organic human arm, and the other arm is completely metal, and that's the bionic arm. So in this game, they chose to go with the latter. So when you see him in prison, he's basically a one-armed man, but where his other arm would be, there's his whole shoulder blade and the side of his body is all metal and stuff. It's like you could tell that something was supposed to be there but was taken away from him. So he gets out of prison, they give him his arm back, and they're like, okay, you've got to go into this place called Ascension City, where this terrorist force known as BioRain has blown Ascension City up. They basically task Spencer with going in there and saving the day, taking out BioRain's men. And you're not rescuing Super Joe for once, which is kind of nice. It runs on the same engine as Bionic Commando Rearmed did. It was an engine that Grin developed called the Diesel engine, which I thought was clever. But it's a completely different game. It's entirely 3D. It's, behind the character camera, And it doesn't feel like Bionic Commando at all. It feels very much like a 2009 generic shooter with some bionics tacked onto it. And I tried playing it, I didn't really get into it. I watched a good part of a playthrough just so I could kind of experience the story because, you know, it is part of Bionic Commando lore. And even then I was like, oh, this is really kind of dragging on. So I'm not a huge fan of this game. It's kind of unfortunate that this is where the series ended up, and the reviews were mediocre too. People were like, yeah, I mean, it's a game. It's certainly a competent game, but even the concept of being able to swing around, it just wasn't handled as well as it could have. Progress was very stunted. It wasn't very open world. It was like, you know, you get stuck in one small area, you got to beat all the enemies, and then you get stuck in another small area, and you got to beat all the enemies there. It's like, I wanted a real 3D version of Bionic Commando where I could swing around anywhere I wanted to and you know, have to find maybe the door that's going to open up the exit to the level, or, you know, the communications area that's going to open up to the level. Something that resembled the original gameplay of the original games that I loved so much, and they just didn't put it in there. They made it more like a traditional 3D action shoot-'em-up platformer kind of game. So, oh well. I do enjoy the artwork of the game. Some of the music is pretty good. Like I said, it's not really my style of music, but you know, that last piece I really liked, and there's another piece that I wanted to share as well, and that one is called Hunters for the FSA, which is the organization, the military organization that you are a part of. And again, that was composed by Jamie Christopherson. So let's give a listen to Hunters for the FSA. See, I told you that melody would come back again and again. Ba-da-da-da-da-da-da. Hunters for the FSA, composed by Jamie Christopherson from Bionic Commando 2009. You can still find this on PC, Xbox 360, and PS3. And I like this track because A, it includes the Bionic Commando theme, really nicely done as an orchestral arrangement, but also the beat that this song uses, that kind of industrial dustled beat, a grittier version of that is also used by Simon Viklund in Bionic Commando Rearmed in a track that calls back to Rob Hubbard's original Commando theme that he composed for the Commodore 64 port of the game. So there's a lot of really cool history behind this track, and I like the melding of the beat from the original Commando song and the melody of the Bionic Commando song all kind of smooshed in to one. So the song reminds me of a lot of different things. This is one of the first games, I think, where online media really influenced the development of the game. I remember the original images of Spencer being released on the web, and his bionic arm had all of these kind of reddish, brownish tubes coming out of it, and it became kind of a meme, and everybody started calling it Hot Dog Arm, and Hot Dog Arm was like a big thing for a while, and it was just, Spencer's bionic arm with these electronic tubes coming out of it. And it was hilarious. And then Capcom just kind of quietly started adding new, updated images of Spencer with an arm that had some of those tubes, but they were like more internal now, and they weren't as hot doggy as before. So I thought that was really cool that because the internet was making fun of it, that they kind of went back and redid it. And I'd never experienced something like that before. I think that was, like 2000. So this must have been like 2007, 2008, like before the game came out, where the internet was starting to become powerful in terms of manipulating the media that comes out. And this was the first instance that I'd really kind of experienced that firsthand. So just a cool little trivia fact about this game. A little bit about Jamie Christopherson. He's composed probably just as many pieces of music for film and television as he has for video games. He was originally from Los Angeles, California, born in 1975, and ended up moving to Boston and received his master's degree later on in music from the University of Miami in 2000. And 2000 was the year of his first composition, just a short film called Lost Cause. I'm not going to go through all the film and television stuff because that's not really the focus of this podcast. But as far as the list of stuff that I've seen for music and film that he's composed for, it's nothing that's been extremely popular that I'm aware of. A lot of television films, a lot of short films for a lot of directors that I'm not very familiar with. But then again, I'm not a huge film fan anyways. He started composing for video games in 2003 with Toontown Online, and the next year after that, The Lord of the Rings, The Battle for Middle-earth. Co-composed music for Onimusha, Dawn of Dreams for the PlayStation 2 in 2006. Worked on the second Lord of the Rings game, Battle for Middle-earth 2, again in 2006. Composed music for Stranglehold, The Golden Compass, Blade Storm, Spider-Man Web of Shadows, Command & Conquer 3, Lost Planet 2, Dead Rising 2 and 3 and 4. Did a little bit of music for Metal Gear Rising Revengeance and Warriors Legends of Troy. So a lot of AAA titles under his belt, and I can see why. He has a great handle on cinematic composition, and a lot of these games really beg for that kind of music. especially, his earlier titles being like The Lord of the Rings, you're not gonna have, electronic techno music for a game like that. You're gonna want something that's dramatic and orchestral and will suit the mood of the game. So I was unaware of his pedigree up until this point, and I thought that was really cool, and I guess I was kind of correct seeing his film composition roots showing through, because a lot of the soundtrack for this game is very cinematic and very film-like. It is cool to see the original Bionic Commando themes kind of intermixed with that kind of a film orchestral score, though. I can't deny that. When I was watching the playthrough of the game, it was kind of fun seeing violin swells and then hearing little faint hints of Bionic Commando melodies kind of wafting through here and there, and I would just point to the screen and go, oh, I know that song! Kind of like the last one we listened to. Anyways, we've got one more game to tackle before we end the show, and that is, of course, Bionic Commando Rearmed 2, featuring more music from Mr. Simon Viklund. This one was released in 2011, which to this day has been the last time we've heard anything about a new Bionic Commando game. Very unfortunate, but we've got some opinions on this one. Lots of opinions on Bionic Commando Rearmed 2. But before we get to them, I want to play for you Flutes of Ektanadu. Let's hit it. Alright, that was Flutes of Ektanadu from Bionic Commando Rearmed 2, released in 2011 and composed by Simon Viklund. It's not following any exact Bionic Commando melodies from the original game or the NES game or anything like that, but it's like, it feels Bionic Commando. I think Simon Viklund basically took all of the knowledge that he has of all of the Bionic Commando songs and was able to create new melodies that almost sound like maybe that was in a Bionic Commando game, but not quite. But really cool stuff. I like that he started blending a little bit of the chiptune stuff. There's some arpeggios in there. There's little loops of like bongo drums. This game takes place more on like a tropical island, so there's a little bit of island flavor in some of the tunes. And I don't know, it's just fun. It's a little bit shorter than his other tunes, but I don't think he had nearly as much time to work on this music as he did with the original game. The story behind this one is that Grin was working on Rearmed 2 with Viklund as creative director again, and for reasons unknown to me, Grin ended up going bankrupt, which to me sounds strange because I would think that Capcom would have been funding them to create this game for them. In any case, Grin goes under, probably because their main Bionic Commando game didn't do nearly as well as they wanted it to, even though Rearmed was a success. So Rearmed 2 kind of got stalled and was picked up by another development company called Fat Shark. So Grin gave Fat Shark all of their code for the game, which they then owned the rights to, and Viklund kind of stayed on for the transition, at least according to an interview that I read with him. So he still was in charge of the music, which the majority of which had already been written, and he basically made sure that the guys at Fat Shark understood the code that they were giving them, and basically hung around to answer any questions or inquiries about the Bionic Commando lore that they had created with the original game, and that was it. So Fat Shark took that code, however much was done with it, and created a new game around it, and it was not as good. I could not finish it. I didn't even really play that much of it, unfortunately. One of the major sticking points about it for me and for lots of other critics of the game was that they added the ability to jump. And of course, it's what detractors of Bionic Commando have wanted for ages and ages and ages. But for fans of Bionic Commando, it's like the opposite. We love it because you can do all this stuff without jumping. And now you're like, well, we're going to make it so that you have to jump, and then also use that jump plus your bionic arm to play the game. And I don't know, it didn't feel like Bionic Commando once they added the jump in, because now there were just different rules, and it wasn't as authentic. It was like adding a slide to Mega Man, and I know people are going to hate me for saying that, but as a huge fan of Mega Man 2, that's where I'm coming from with this. So, the basic plot is that it takes place a little bit after Rearmed, the original game, but before the Bionic Commando 2009 game. There's a dictator called General Sabio, and a commander from Spencer's organization called Colonel Brubaker goes missing, and Spencer and a team of 4 other Bionics are sent to locate Brubaker and his platoon and help them complete their mission of disarming Sabio's missiles. So, kind of a Super Joe situation, but it's more like a whole platoon needs to be rescued instead of just Joe. Evidently, the incidents that take place in this game directly result in Bionics being outlawed at the beginning of the Bionic Commando 2009 game. So the timeline, they're all canonical. This isn't just like an offshoot sequel to a remaster of the original game. It's all of these do take place in the same universe, which is really cool. There's local co-op too, which I thought was kind of neat. I never was able to play it with anybody, but having 2 Bionic Commandos swinging around on the screen seems like a very cool thing. There's also none of the top-down levels. Remember, I was talking earlier in the show about meeting a truck and descending and getting those continues from those Commando-like original stages. Those are gone, so a lot of the cool stuff that made the original Commando game fun, they had taken away, and they had added things that make it less fun. So, I don't know. My reaction is lukewarm on this. Other people's reactions are lukewarm on this. Unfortunately, this kind of killed the Bionic Commando series. It wasn't even really that well optimized. A lot of people were criticizing it because it had poor frame rates and just general issues in graphics altogether. And they sold less than 10,000 copies on Xbox Live Arcade the year it was released. So, yeah. But we got a new Rearmed soundtrack out of it, which, like I said, I didn't think it was as good as the original one, but it still has great Simon Viklund music. So, as our last track of the show, we're going to listen to another track from Rearmed 2 called Monte Blanco, again composed by Simon Viklund. Alright kids, that was Monte Blanco from Bionic Commando Rearmed 2, released on the PS3, Xbox 360 in 2011, composed by Simon Viklund. And I am pleased by this song, I think. It's got elements of the overhead map screen from the original Bionic Commando kind of mixed up with that Bionic Commando theme, but it's not the full theme, it's kind of an interpretation of the theme, so it's cool. It's a short little track. Like I said, all of the music in Rearmed 2 is a lot shorter. The whole soundtrack in general is much more loopy, I guess you could say, than the original Rearmed, and I think that was basically boiled down to a lot of what we just talked about, where Simon Viklund just wasn't able to work on the music as much, because I think once Fat Shark took over, he probably wasn't getting paid to do the work, so I wouldn't be making super long pieces of music either if I wasn't going to be able to feed my family. Anyways, it's unfortunate that Bionic Commando, this series so far, has gone out on such a meh note. I do eventually want to go back to Rearmed 2 and try to play it again. Maybe there's something there that I'm not seeing that is cool. I did recently, in doing the research for this show, come across a little blurb that the designers of the game made the game beatable without jumping, even though there was a jump button. So that's at least a little show of respect for us hardcore fans. So maybe I could try to get through it without jumping. Maybe that would be fun. I don't know. But, if any of you guys have had any experience with Bionic Commando and you'd like to share it, just hop on the Discord. Let me know. You can tweet at me. Let me know. You can find me on Twitter at the VGMbassy. You can find the show on iTunes, Google Play Music, Spotify, Amazon Podcasts, Stitcher, any podcatcher, really. If you know some friends who really enjoy video game music and you think they might like this show, let them know. Send them on over my way. You can head them over to thevgembassy.com, and I've got links to all of my social media on there, as well as links to all of my shows, which you can play in the browser for each post, where you can look at the track listing while you listen. Isn't it great? Isn't technology absolutely wonderful? While you're on the website, you can look at the amazing art created by Indira J. And at the beginning of each show, you can listen to the incredible theme song composed by Trevin Hughes, aka Dread. And you can also look at all the links we have to places like Discord, where you can come join our Discord server and hang out with us and talk about video game music and video games and basically anything. It's very active. We have at least some activity going on every single day, and some great conversations and some great friends, and lots of different channels for lots of different topics. You can also head over to patreon.com/thevgembassy, and you can find out how, for a small donation each month, you can contribute to the show. You can get super cool bonuses. You can get an extra monthly podcast called Embassy Exclusive, where myself and my friends Joe and Todd tackle gaming topics and ask the patrons questions and let them participate in some cool stuff as well. So coming up on the VG Embassy, we have a few cool things. We have a guest episode with a VG ambassador on one of our highest Patreon tiers. We have a blind listen with our dear friend Ryan Steele. We have maybe a VGM Jukebox style episode coming up. I think I just put that into the works, so you can look forward to some user-submitted picks and more cool solo stuff. So like I said, if there's anything you guys would like to see me tackle, anything that you've heard me say I'm a fan of and might be interested in hearing me do a show on, let me know. You can also email me at thevgembassy@gmail.com. And speaking of Patreon and patrons, etc., one of the Patreon rewards is getting to be thanked by name at the end of every episode. So without further ado, here are some of my biggest fans. At our tourist level, Cameron Childs of the Mad Gear Band, Daryl Bowers aka The Last Rican from VGM Fight Club, Dan Lawton, and Bedroth from the Very Good Music VGM podcast. Our VGMaseries, Chris Murray, Chris Myers, and Chris Steenerson, Gannon11 aka Mike Stark from the Norwalk Gamer Symphony Orchestra, Jordan Worma from the Table to Stage podcast, Kyle Kroll, and The Dyad. Our audio attaché members, Cameron Worma, Carlos from a Heroes 3 podcast, and Scott McElhone. Our special agents, Ryan Steele and Volt Supreme from Volt Supreme Synth VGM Dream Stream Machine, and our lovely VG ambassadors, Frankly Zappa, and the patron saint of VGM podcasts, Alex the Messenger from A VGM Journey. Whew, this was a long show. I had a lot of fun. I hope you guys learned a little bit about Bionic Commando and got to enjoy some of the music. I'd love to hear what you thought, and I'd love to hear what you think of Bionic Commando on a whole, so get in touch with me. Let me know. In the meantime, stay safe and keep listening to awesome VGM. Bye, everyone.